The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Let me say a little bit about the course. We all have views of evolution. You've all taken high school biology. You've all been exposed to a set of concepts. It's a very broad set of concepts. It connects in many, many different ways across the culture. But fundamentally, evolution is a scientific subject. And people who work in evolution sometimes are amazed at all the religious controversy because it's basically a scientific topic. And so we'll talk about some of these questions. But it should be an area that you're all coming to MIT, you all should have opinions, and you all should have some exposure to the set of ideas of evolution. All right, so a little bit about the course concept. Darwin is a key figure, and as you all know, he's associated with evolution. And sometimes people think, oh, evolution is Darwin. But that is not my view. Darwin was one of the most important exponents of an approach to evolution that was developed in the 19th century. Tremendously important figure. But evolution as a topic has been around for centuries. And evolution connects to many, many different science fields. And so Darwin was the chief exponent of natural selection in the 19th century. But evolutionary thought can be traced all the way back to Aristotle, many, many figures from the past. So what we will do in this class is we're going to trace some of these ideas with the notion of trying to see how the basis of evolution was established through various speculators in the history of ideas. My bias in this course is a little more history of ideas, maybe, perhaps, than literary history. I mean, literary history is one of my areas of expertise, but I'm particularly interested in looking at this topic through the history of ideas, because there have been many speculators who have talked about things related to evolution, and so those are the figures I will be examining. And the way the course is designed is we'll look at some pre-Darwin thinkers. For example, David Hume, very, very important philosopher of the 18th century. And Hume was a speculator about miracles and a whole range of topics related to the way in which the world may have come into existence. Hume is sometimes seen as a skeptic, but he actually, the book of his that we will read will provide three different perspectives on how the world came into existence. It's a wonderful dialogue, a set of dialogues. So we'll also read Thomas Malthus, his essay on population, and that's a tremendously important work, one of the first big works that put together a sort of a statistical approach to thinking with the cycles of life itself, and came up with a theory about the difference between the way in which production could be increased and the way in which populations increased, and the fact that there was a differential. So we'll look at these are pre-Darwinian thinkers. So we will look at some of those people. We will then we will have a big unit on Darwin, and we will read a pretty big chunk of The Origin. It's a great book. It's a bit of a challenge too to read for modern people, because it's a scientific work, but it's not written the way science is not done this way today. Science is done in papers and shorter presentations. So it'll be a bit of a challenge. But I have lots and lots of material on it, and we will really get into the core of Darwin's Origin of Species. Really try to understand it as a book and what Darwin was up to. Then we will read a bunch of post-Darwinian figures, people who were influenced by the Darwinian view of the world, and wrote works of literature, speculation, all sorts of interesting science fiction, all sorts of interesting material that flowed out of Darwin's thinking, or not necessarily flowed out of his thinking, but was influenced by his thinking. So we'll look at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a very famous work, and try to understand that from a Darwinian point of view. What was Stevenson, how was Darwinian thinking influencing that work? And then we'll finish with a unit actually on feedback theory and modern views of machines and machine thought. One of the questions we will explore in this class is, can machines be made to think? Could machines think? So we will look at a number of controversies that emerged out of the in the 20th century, but were based in evolutionary thinking. And we're going to look at one of the key figures we'll look at is Norbert Wiener, and we'll read one of his works. And he was a very important thinker on contemporary feedback theory. He was an MIT professor, actually. Very colorful and important thinker. So we'll read his work, and we'll look at Turing, some of Turing's papers on the Turing test and machine intelligence. So at the end of the course, my hope is you will see how all these different topics are connected organically together into a whole set of questions. This is a class, as many humanities classes are, about questions. It's not necessarily a class about answers. I don't have specific answers. I'm not here to promote one view of evolution or religion or anything like that. I'm here to ask the questions and to get you thinking. And, you know, I really don't care what your ultimate view of the world what it emerges as, or what it is. I'm not here to change that. But what I am here to do is talk about evolution and sort of think about it as a whole system and ask interesting questions about it. So, okay, any questions here? Let's talk a little bit about some of these early questions. So this is a class that has design in the title. What do we mean by design? What is design? MIT is a place that design is all over the place. It's like everybody talks about design. So what does the word mean? Can anybody come up with a definition of design or describe something about design? Yes?
Design's, I think, how the things we see are the way they are because someone designed them, like a higher being. So kind of like the idea of a god or someone who designed everything.
Okay, that's one concept of design, a sort of theological concept of design. Absolutely true. That's one way in which people use that word. What about the word itself? What do we mean when we say design? Yeah.
I think it has a lot to do with the planning involved before the creation.
Okay. And what about how is that consistent with design over in course 2, mechanical engineering?
Well, they would, I guess, carefully plan out how the machine works, what they want to make it do before they actually make it.
Okay. So there's some kind of intention involved, some kind of planning ahead of time. Anything else?
I think it's putting an idea into work, like taking it a step further than just an idea in your head.
Okay. So implementing something.
Yeah.
Any other? Yes?
I think sort of creation with a specific purpose in mind. you don't just blindly start designing a machine. You have something that you want it to do first.
Okay. Yeah, those are some key words that there. Yeah. Yeah, there's a purpose. So purpose is usually associated with the concept of design, isn't it? The classic definition, or one classic definition of design, is just adaptation of means to ends. So an end is something that you're trying to accomplish. You have a set of means. I mean, what about all the contests that get done in, over in course 2, where people design, they're given a certain amount of material and they have to carry out a certain task. That's a classic design situation where there is a goal and you have a certain set of means and you adapt those means to the goal. So in design we have this concept of purpose, and it's a very, very important part. So how does this relate to these two figures here? The left one is a deity creating the world. It's from William Blake's, one of William Blake's works. And right, we have Darwin sitting here as a young man, very quiet and looking out and staring at us. So how are these two figures related to concepts of design? A couple of people said already, creation of the world. Why is a world associated with design and the concept of creation with a purpose? What is it about the world that leads to that sort of thinking? Yes.
It's constantly changing. Whether you believe in creation or evolution, the world is constantly adapting to what's happening around, humans specifically, I guess, and animals.
Okay, so the world shows the ability to change, or things in the world change, and what's peculiar about the change? What is it about the change?
It's so that you fit in better with your surroundings.
Okay, so there seems to be some kind of goal that is being achieved in these changes, is there not? So what else about the world leads to these notions of a grand designer? Yeah.
The fact that it's so complex and so unique, could this come about without an intelligent designer?
Yeah, I mean, the more we learn about the world, the more incredible it is, isn't it? I mean, when we really study closely the phenomena of the world, we see patterns and adaptations that are just kind of incredible. I mean, you find insects that are perfectly adapted to the other organisms they feed on, their limbs and everything. I mean, you find this constant process of, in fact, of adaptation in the world. So when you step back and you look at the world, it's a fairly complicated, but nevertheless it's full of purpose, isn't it? I mean, it seems so. It certainly is full of adaptation. And of course, adaptation is one of the big topics of evolution. Things get adapted, and amazingly well. Worker bees, I mean, think of them. They don't even reproduce, and there they are. They're creation, they work together collectively to support the hive. And how did that all happen? That kind of complexity in human behavior.
In the world, there is a purpose in mind, but the purpose itself is really vague when you compare it in terms of human design. And I think human design, this concept that the world is designed is, if you look at the past, the history of man, all technological progression is very intentional with a purpose. But so once again, it seems improbable that the world was just came about randomly.
Okay, so you're really making an interesting distinction here, and one is humans seem to definitely have this kind of purposive process where they have needs and they develop tools and implements. I mean, who can fail to be impressed with, you know, the early implements of early humans, you know, how ingenious they were, you know, capturing fire and doing all sorts of things with the primitive tools they had, and learning how to interact with their environments too. And that's very impressive, the record of humans, just in their ability to design. But then you mention the outside world itself. Humans didn't design, and yet it also shows patterns and designs.
And I think at the same time, though, there's also in the outside world. Well, if you go by Darwinian thought, like the ultimate idea is what is better, not necessarily what achieves a certain purpose.
Okay, so any further comments on the outside world and design? What was Darwin's contribution to design? I mean, how did Darwin get, how did his work approach? What realm was he primarily interested in, and how did he approach this concept of design? Why is evolution at the center of the discussion of design?
Is a plausible theory for the design of the current world that is accepted by the many.
Darwin came up with some new approaches to the concept of how design might take place in organisms, in the organic world. Darwin came up with some new approaches in which a designer was not necessarily the agent of the design. And this threw a big wrench into the whole discussion. There's a sort of conflict of terms in Darwinian language, which we'll find. But where a lot of the original work in Darwinian thinking was around this concept of how could these patterns and adaptations emerge in the world without being put there by some individual intentionally, but through a natural process of interaction with the surroundings of the world. So this was a very great problem, and Darwin came up with some approaches to thinking about design that really changed the way in which we use the term in the natural world. And thus, humans and their very direct purposive way of designing was seen as somewhat separate from the natural world in the way in which design emerged in the natural world. But let's have a look. Okay, let's go to this. Okay, so this one of the key questions in Darwinian thinking emerged around the question of, can there be design without a designer? And here you see some very natural implements. You see work from Leonardo's great sketchbook, gears and cogs, and then you see a simple shell design. You see two approaches, two kinds of design here. What's the difference? Okay, so we have a type of design that emerges from the natural world, and we have a thinking human coming up with concepts of designs and patterns. Yes?
But isn't thinking kind of also a natural process? So wouldn't everything, like, we can't, like, why do we as humans distinguish ourselves from the rest of the natural world, and like put like a barrier in between, saying like, oh, the things that they do are natural and what we do is not natural?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, certainly if what we say, if humans are product of the natural world, then whatever they do is in some sense a natural product, is it not? So are there differences? how do humans change the formula? Do they change the formula at all? I mean, we don't have to say it's unnatural to design a chair to sit in, because we can say, well, this is. But do humans do anything different? What do humans bring to the whole process? Okay, a purpose. What is the purpose in the design of the shell?
Protection, like
Okay,
a home for the creature inside it.
all right. So did the creature design it, or? So you see, we come up into some, in this area, we come up into a big ambiguity. And that is, we have natural designs, but we don't necessarily have an author for them who actually built the thing just like it was. We can refer to a process and say, well, these emerged through, the interaction of millions of years of development and so on and so forth. But so whereas in the human, we have a, as you say, self-conscious, intentional purpose, and to build something with a certain effect. Now, the point of whether one's natural or one's artificial may be, not that important. But the process that humans kind of speed up design, don't they? I mean, think how fast humans, just think of the rise of the car, the automobile, how fast that all took place, period of a couple of 100 years. So human design tends to iterate, does it not, very quickly, and reproduce itself and improve itself and so on and so forth. So there's a very definite design process that you're all here to study. Whatever your respective field is, you're probably involved in some aspect of design, whether you're designing a polymer, or you're designing a new kind of material, or we design, MIT is a center for design. But it's this very intentional, deeply informed type of design. In the natural world, how does design take place? What is the scale of it? Sorry?
Survival of the fittest?
Well, that's one of the, we'll explore that later in the term will come, yeah. But I'm sort of thinking just in terms of the time scale for designs to emerge in the natural world. Yes?
Well, the time scale depending on whether you're thinking about planets themselves or just Earth. It's just enormous.
Yeah, so part of what happened in Darwin's time was it became clear that from geological study that the Earth was really very, very old, and not just a few thousand years old as some of the earlier speculators had thought. So Darwin had millions of years to work with when he began to think about his system. And of course, with millions of years and many, many different changes, many, many different generations, very tiny shifts in one direction could add up to huge changes over a couple of 100,000 years. So Darwin began to expand into this huge time scale that geology had given him. And we'll look at that a little more closely when we get to the Darwin unit, because geology was really one of Darwin's first areas of interest. But now he had millions of years to work with. Then he could begin to think of incremental changes that would add up to tremendous adaptations. So human design is always, we always think of it in a very collapsed, tight time scale, whereas natural design we think of in the terms of emerging through eons, thousands, millions of years. Okay, so those are a couple of things we can say. One of the problems of using the word design is, can we really use design for these shells? I mean, in what sense is design the right word? Is a snowflake, can we say a snowflake is design? So this word design it gives us a lot of difficulty, which is good because it makes us think about the question. But What about the applying this word design to snowflakes or natural? Yeah.
Well, if we like define design as, something towards a purpose, and like what you said about how the animal doesn't design the shell, then the purpose is more so adapted by the user than it was designed.
Okay.
Like the purpose of the shell was only granted by the animal that uses it.
Okay. I think I'm getting that. Yeah. So what you're saying is purpose really. Are you saying purpose is just an individual thing in these, or that it doesn't exist?
I don't know. I guess in my mind there's just kind of a divide between cognizant animals and users, than just something like a shell. It's almost a mineral formation, like a geological formation.
It's like a pattern.
Yeah.
So is there a difference between designs and patterns? I think so. I mean, patterns are certain, there are regularities in patterns and so forth, but we don't necessarily assign an intention to them. Nobody intended. Yes?
I think one of the distinctions is that when we think of design from a human perspective, we have it's purpose driven, where you have a purpose first before you design, whereas with the shell, the purpose is more applied to the finished product.
Okay.
Oh, here's the shell. I think I'll use it as a home rather than I need a home, so I'll build a shell.
Okay.
So the purpose comes after whatever it is.
Okay.
Rather than,
So that's in a case where something acquires, but if the shell is the object, is the organism, we wouldn't assign purpose to that organism in creating its own shell, because it didn't do anything intentionally. The shell simply exists, and so this is an ambiguity. We oftentimes assign purpose to patterns when we don't really mean it. I mean, we say, my computer is giving me a lot of trouble, or my computer is, we don't really mean that the computer is doing something intentionally. So there is a way in which humans assign the word purpose, the concept of purpose, to designs where just for a kind of a shorthand. We're going to explore this problem. This is a very, very big problem. And nobody's ever really solved this, made a really clear way of coming up with this concept of applying design to natural objects.
Well, I guess are evolutionary concepts ever applied to non-living things?
Non-living things. There have been some special cases, but generally not. Evolution is seen primarily as a phenomenon of life. And it's a remarkable phenomenon because when humans discovered that life forms changed, this was really big news. I mean, this was kind of astounding because people thought basically the forms had been put on the earth and they were that way forever. What happened to make people think forms changed?
Was it learning about the Galapagos Islands?
Well, that was certainly a classic example of it. Yeah, people began to discover. There were lots of speculation about changing forms, and certain early thinkers actually detected certain types of changes in living forms, but the discovery of fossils and older forms began to really change people's concepts of what existed. When Darwin traveled to South America, he found fossils in a lot of the geological areas he studied, and these were of organisms that didn't exist anymore. So people had to come up with some kind of explanation. Some people thought they were monsters from some ancient time or something like that. There were all kinds of theories about how to explain the fossil remains of the Earth. And that was just one area, but there were a number of areas that began to change people's way of thinking about life forms and their change. Okay, so, well, we're going to come back to the concept of design, but it's really central to what we're trying to explore in this course. And the ambiguity is what I'm interested in, because we have this kind of play of the word design, and we apply the word design to natural objects, but we don't fully mean that that individual object was intended to be exactly as it is by some maker. Now, we have a lot of ways of thinking about that, but we'll explore some of those. And Darwin, of course, had to deal with that. Okay, so one of the things that I think is important for our study is just sort of the understanding a little bit about the concept of nature itself. How we talk about nature and what nature is, and the environment in which we live in. And so many of the works we're going to be reading explore reflect different concepts of the natural world. And in Darwin's time, probably the leading view of the world, or one of the leading views, because there are many different elements and aspects to every culture, but one of the dominant views, certainly in educated circles, was the sort of romantic view of the world as the romantic image of nature itself. And I'm going to ask you to read a short poem in a minute, but this was one of the famous, and it's set at this location. This is an abbey, and it was a abbey in England that William Wordsworth visited, and on the occasion of his visit in 1798, he actually wrote a very famous poem that reflected some of his concepts of the natural world and memory and some other elements that we'll talk about in a minute. But I just want you to think about this relation of design here in this picture. Look at these. What's happening in this picture, this painting? This is a painting by Edward Days, and it was painted a little bit before the time that Wordsworth visited. But what do you see in this picture that says something about design? What kind of design do we have here? We've been talking about artificial and natural designs.
It seems like nature kind of modified the abbey that humans designed. I don't know what's the fair lines go.
Okay. Yeah, there's something going on here, isn't there? It's I suppose an architect or an engineer would say, well, that's a serious case of wear. This ancient abbey that was designed by some masterful architect and built is falling apart. So it's a ruined abbey. It's a church structure, a structure designed to give shelter, to make a statement about views of religious views. And it's put on the earth, and yet over time, the earth gradually is taking it back, and eventually there won't be anything left. So we see the intersection of, and we could say the natural world is also a world that reflects design. So this comes back to this kind of ambiguity between human design, your point, and if we're humans, we're part of the natural world, and the fact that everything that gets designed ultimately wears down, eventually collapses. So humans are in this constant kind of tension with the natural world, as are all individuals. The natural world reclaims itself. Yeah.
So, like, if we see that nature kind of has its own way, like, if we say that the flourishing of nature is kind of a type of design, then wouldn't there be like a clash of designs? Like, isn't there a clash of designs between nature's design and like human design? Like, say, suppose we design something for our purposes, but maybe this design is hindering the progress of somebody else's design, and if we let it sit and we don't use it anymore, someone else's design might decide, oh, okay, I need the space back, and so I'm gonna, I guess, design and grow over it or something like that. And so there's like a constant conflict between different designs. And so like maybe there aren't just one type of design, but many that are competing to, I guess, survive or something.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about sort of human artificial objects? Yeah, I mean, there are many cases where old abbeys were taken, the stones were taken from them to build new structures, and so and space is always something that people build something on it, and then somebody else comes along and wants to build something different, or something bigger, or something newer, or something. So yeah, we're constantly sort of in some kind of conflict, even with our own designs. But all of our designs are also in conflict with some natural process out there. We have a few minutes, and I'd like to pass out William Wordsworth's poem and have you read it over, and maybe we'll get a few minutes to talk about it a little bit here in class too. This is a very important poem of William Wordsworth's. Its title is Tintern Abbey, in which he it's a wonderful poem. It's a beautiful poem. It's written by Wordsworth on a tour to this location, Tintern Abbey. And it's a poem of memory about his sister Dorothy, but also about just his relationship with nature and how he viewed nature and the human relationship to nature. So if you take, let's take 10 minutes and see how far you get in this poem, and we can start talking about it, and then we'll come back to it next class. Okay, you can, you can't read a poem like this in 10 minutes, but I'd like you to read it over the weekend here. But what can we say about this view that Wordsworth is expressing in here? His view of nature. And what does his view of nature have to do with Tintern Abbey? He doesn't really talk about the Abbey too much, does he? What's Wordsworth interested in here? What's he talking about? Sorry? Okay, so his response to nature is what? How? Obviously, he's a deep admirer of the natural world and nature itself. What are some other things that what are some things he says about it that captured your attention? Yeah.
Loyal, judging from that quote on the slide. He
Okay.
describes it as loyal, committed to.
Okay. He feels his relationship to nature is a kind of a very spiritual and trusting and sort of a sense of the incredible sense of well-being he feels in natural environments. So that, there's this very, very powerful mood in the poem itself, is there not, about just being in nature? I mean, you must, do any of you have, do you have similar types of responses? Some of you go hiking or go out into the world. How do you feel about being in nature? And is that similar to what Wordsworth feels? Yes?
He mentioned that it seems like some people, it feels like they're running away from something bad as opposed to running towards something good. And he feels like what even like bad things that happen in nature, it's just driving him towards something good. Like I feel like he's a really positive person.
Yes, he certainly he has a very beautiful, capacious sense of nature itself as being a place that is humans are intimately related to. And in some sense, humans are of nature. They come from nature, and there's a sort of sense of the benignness and support of natural forms. He distinguishes between his youth and his later years. Yes.
About how the older he gets, the more beautiful nature gets.
Yeah.
And so he really didn't understand it when he was a younger boy, but when he keeps coming back to it, he appreciates it more and more.
Yeah.
So his relationship with nature is ever evolving.
It's sort of it evolves in his sense. Yes. So he speaks of he says in line 65 down here. Or just start at about line 60. And now with gleams of half-extinguished thought, and with many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity, the picture of the mind revives again. So his mental process is really important here. This is a poem partly about the mental process of interaction and the spiritual process in the mind, being in the mind, the life of the mind. The picture of the mind revives again. While here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years. And so I dare to hope, though changed, no doubt, from what I was at first. I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains, by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days, and their glad animal moments all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love that had no need of a remoter charm, by thoughts supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. That time is past. This is the shift. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. Not for this faint eye, nor mourn, nor murmur. Other gifts have followed, for such loss I would believe, abundant recompense. For I have learned to look on nature not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. So what's he talking about here? What does he find in nature? Yeah.
It seems that nature encompasses man, no matter how hard man tries to impose its design on nature. It will always envelop.
Yeah, it's capacious. It's the source. It's the ultimate source of what we are. I mean, we can't divorce ourselves from nature, or we shouldn't. Does Wordsworth feel that sometimes humans do divorce elsewhere in the poem? He sees that there's a kind of conflict in them, is there not, between being in nature and what he calls the sort of the tediousness of urban living. He sort of sees the country versus the city, the urban versus the wild, is definitely something that is a conflict that emerges in this work. But he sees in nature what else? not just the source of our existence and our being. What else is infused in nature?
Like being in like a tranquil state of mind and feeling like you're part of a whole rather than feeling like you're an individual.
Certainly that. Tranquility. This, he sees a scene, he's looking down on this scene from above, not this perspective, but from above. But he sees this tranquil setting. Little smoke puffs coming from the trees way down below. He's on some cliffs above. But he sees even more than that in nature. Yes?
I think he's sort of comparing, when he compares how he saw nature before to how he does now.
Yeah.
Before he just took it more superficially, that it's beautiful, it's nice to look at,
Yeah.
it's there. And now it seems that he's more comparing things and seeing how everything is interconnected.
Yeah, he sees the texture, the organic quality of the interconnectedness of things in nature. And he identifies him as part of that, himself as part of that. He feels akin to that. He feels embraced by that. But he also sees in nature some kind of a force, does he not? I mean, what's he talking about here? He says, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns. What's he talking about here? I mean, what is the argument for the spiritual quality of nature? This is, or argument, what is the, how does this emerge in Wordsworth's poem? I mean, nature is not just a set of objects in which he relates to beauteous forms, but it has more, does it not? Yes.
Why that there's like some sort of deity or designer behind it all that's like responsible for...
Well, probably, yeah. I mean, designer is probably not what he has in mind, but certainly a spiritual force, a spiritual essence in nature itself that he identifies with. And he doesn't have a name for it. You could say, well, maybe he's a pantheist, or maybe we could put labels on Wordsworth, but that would be missing the point of the poem. It's this sense of that there's a larger force in the natural surroundings that humans have come from that can be discerned or detected or felt if you allow yourself to become part of it. So this is a tremendous source of many romantics explored these ideas of where does the spiritual center of the human existence dwell? Where is it? How can it be found? How can it be touched? How can it be seen? How can it be felt? And Wordsworth is poet in chief on this. I mean, he's a tremendous sense of the powers of nature. It is true, the view of nature he has. What kinds of what nature is he talking about? Where is he seeing where is his nature? Yeah.
It's probably in a place that many people go to, and many people have deemed that it's very safe, it's close to civilization, and it isn't really the wilderness and the wild that can be really dangerous.
One of the Huxleys wrote an essay once called "Wordsworth in the Tropics." He said, "Well, in essence, the tropical nature is also beautiful, and Darwin had the same phenomenal experience when he first visited the tropics. He just on his voyage of the Beagle, he wrote about how he was just kind of drunk with the beauty of being in these dense tropical forests and butterflies and things, you know. However, there are things that eat you too, where there are negative forces out there, so it's not always benign. And Wordsworth is, of course, writing really not so much about a wilderness concept of nature, as more pastoral nature in the pastoral sense. And this is a nature that's, you know, more or less inhabited by humans. There are little puffs of smoke coming up through the trees and so forth. Whereas, you know, there are many places and spaces in the world where what we would call nature is tremendously hostile and, you know, foreboding. So it's not necessarily a place that you can assume is going to be a place of comfort and solace and spiritual reward. And of course, we're now just, this was written almost just before 1800, 1798. And we're only 60 years out from Darwin's origin. And Darwin's origin is going to bring a rather different view of nature. But I wouldn't say it's an opposed view. I mean, Darwin himself felt in many ways the way Wordsworth felt about being out in the natural world. And his voyage of the Beagle was one of the great experiences of his life. And he spent lots and lots of time in, you know, very challenging and foreboding landscapes there. But he still carried with him this sense of, you know, nature as a spiritually powerful source of well-being and sense of beauty. And I don't think Darwin ever lost that in his entire life. And yet, in his science, he did something quite different. He was not trying to create, quote, nature, but he was trying to understand living forms and how these forms and the patterns of their existence led to adaptations and the constant change and growth of the evolutionary experience or phenomenon. And that led in quite a different view, in quite a different direction.